I do want to give a few, point out a few wonderful achievements of Jay's, who is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the Royal Society of Literature, and has, at their very young age, too many distinctions to name here. They were selected for the Complete Works program back in 2014. They won the Ted Hughes Award, the Sunday Times University of Warwick Young Writers of the Year Award, and were a fellow at the DAAD in Berlin. Jay also programmed films at the BFI Flair Festival since 2014 and is co-editor at Oxford Poetry. Their name repeatedly comes up as one of the great poets of their generation in Britain, and anyone who has read Jay can only agree. Jay's body of work includes 5 pamphlets and poetry collections, including Surge and Mapping of the Future, several films and multimedia installations, one of them, Far From the Start, currently on view at the Studio Voltaire in London. And I'll mention some of Jay's work that is particularly memorable. My Name is My Own, a physical performance piece in response to June Jordan, which premiered at Southbank Center Poetry International. Joint, a poetic play about the history of joint enterprise, Crystals of the Social Substance, a sound installation at the Serpentine pavilion, and Complicity, a pamphlet based on the collection at the Tate. And you can buy Complicity and Surge from the wonderful red wheelbarrow at the back, and perhaps Jay will be kind enough to sign copies for you afterwards. Jay's creations are rooted in history as a way into self-knowledge, Black British history and social history in particular, and what to make of our relationship to the past. For that, Jay brings together music, sound, poetry, research, and so on, and he'll let us know what the narrative leaves behind tonight. I read in an interview of yours this afternoon a quote that sums it up and sums up your wonderful spirit and humor. You said, "I'm haunted by history, but I always haunt it back."
Thank you. Does everyone hear me all right? Yeah, great, lovely. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. It's always really interesting being in these spaces to present kind of a set of thoughts, ideas, things that I find interesting, stuff that I've kind of watched and read and that has influenced kind of a lot of what I've been doing. And so I was taking this opportunity, I think, to to kind of like riff a bit. Basically, I'm just going to riff on like all the ideas and all the thoughts that I've had that came from this title, What the Narrative Leaves Behind, which I came up with, I think, in the first week here, and have had to sort of like think about what that actually means like in the ensuing months. And it's been quite a generative process to do that. So yeah, without further ado, it was useful to discuss Lovers Rock, both the music genre and the film, with Mabula and David last week, because I realised that there was a lot of crossover with what I wanted to address in this talk. I won't pretend that my ideas have not shifted over the last 6 months, or that what I meant by the narrative and leaving behind of the title hasn't changed in response to what other people have said. I am in medias res, pulling together ideas and observations and trying to understand how they might work together. In some ways, this method is at the heart of the generic origins of Lovers Rock, an ongoing question about how Jamaican or how British it is, how much it is reggae, how much it is something else. The answer, obviously, is that it is both, everything all at once. But the question of where the overlap begins and ends is a delicate one, which reveals as much about the observer as the phenomenon itself. I could talk about the genre all day because it is so revealing about so many things, but I will narrow it down to one specific song, Caught You in a Lie by Louisa Marks. And I will begin here because first, this is one of the earliest Lovers Rock tunes that was created by a British-born singer, and which was recognisably its own genre. Second, I think the song does something fascinating in its movement between reggae and dub. In his excellent podcast, The Strangeness of Dub, Eddie George talks about the pure imaginary that dub engendered being a purely electronic form. This pure imaginary space was then moved from place to place, the house for a blues party, the community hall for a wedding, the street for a carnival, and optimized for the sound system. These sound systems were communitarian DIY affairs, but they employed state-of-the-art technology and genius engineering. It was King Tubby who invented the dub plate. This innovation allowed for a sound to be played but endlessly remixed and reimagined. As Julian Enrique says, these auditory cultures were unique in that a party or a happening was a musical phenomenon in and of itself, not merely or simply a space into which a pre-recorded track was broadcast. This participatory element was beautifully highlighted by Steve McQueen in Lovers Rock, when the crowd begins to dance to Janet Kay's Silly Games, then does an impromptu karaoke. Then as the storyline continues, the music becomes an extra diegetic foreshadowing as we follow the characters into the garden and towards a darker part of the plot. But the reason I wanted to begin with Caught You in a Lie is because there are some haunting similarities between these two songs. Yet crucially, Louisa Marks' track incorporates an unexpected moment of disconnect and dissonance reminiscent of a dub track. Suddenly, halfway through the song, her voice is broken, jumps a beat, the texture disappears, and we hear her distorted voice a cappella, almost as though she were all along toasting on her own record and not conforming to the idea of an embedded singer whose voice is an essential element of the song. In other words, there is a nod to the improvisatory culture the music emerges from, and towards its improvisatory and therefore indeterminate future. The music vanishes and her voice is left behind. At other, more conventional points, her voice vanishes and the music remains. Of course, Marx is the child of Grenadian migrants, and the song is a cover that blends two different songs, Robert Parker and Lee Scratch Perry's Curly Locks. Like so many, it was the product of a collective effort, and the combination of so many different influences results in something entirely new. So this is Louisa Mark. So it's that like moment of weirdness that I'm kind of really interested in, and that kind of intrigues me. Actually, as I was listening to it, I was like, is it going to happen? Oh, Jesus Christ, maybe I hallucinated that all along. It turns out 2.5 minutes is really long when you're sitting in front of people. Anyway, so it's less the content of the song, but more the form that intrigues me here. I'm interested in how this formal approach to creativity works because I have an interdisciplinary practice and I do lots of things, but specifically with this project that I'm trying to kind of develop here at Reed Hall, I'm interested in kind of long form prose and how it works, but I'm also interested in taking ideas from other genres, other areas. So as a poet, I'm kind of moving into like different spaces, trying to kind of see what leaps or dissonances or disconnections people make in ways that are still nonetheless really, really interesting. Prose calls to me because it allows for a certain engagement with a topic that poetry does not, namely the intricate details of, and this is a leap, housing law. The prosaic stuff is nonetheless mysterious in its workings, in its ability to create the colour and atmosphere of what Mark Fisher termed capitalist realism. But it's an area that's defined by direct causation rather than the space of poetry, which is always slanted and counterintuitive and confidential. It's not that I want to move away from any of these things, but I don't know exactly how. And part of working that out has been to explore a very specific area, namely sort of council housing in the UK. And my reason for this is that a problematic area defined by myriad laws, policies, attitudes and regulations that result in a mood or an epoch that appears miasmic and which seems to obscure its own solution. More than that, I'm interested in how this miasma appears as both ghost and weather in ordinary people's lives, and how specifically ordinary people follow a very specific pattern of migration from the Caribbean to London. Something about the overlapping of migratory and native communities, pre- and post-empire ideas of the nation, war and welfare state, ideology and necessity, town and country, suburb and inner city, seems embodied in Louisa Marks' song, which manages to capture the bucolic and the urban at once via a blend of whimsy and jazz and reggae and electronica, each with their own pinings and cravings. More than that, it signals a cultural shift that coincides with an ideological one. As the first massive wave of Jamaican migrants was settling into London proper, the big ideas of mass housing were on their way out. And I don't think that that is merely a coincidence, or rather, I think there is something telling about this coincidence, something to be further explored. In thinking about Caribbean migrants, I don't mean to exclude other groups, but I am interested in thinking about the lives of people who are constantly marginal or somehow extraneous to those narratives of national progress. part of why council housing is such an emotive issue is because it touches on questions of what a citizen is entitled to demand from its government. It took 2 wars and millions dead for the idea of general social provision to take hold. Homes for Heroes was an unavoidable political project given the scale of the sacrifice people had made. And the country made it clear that it was not interested in the dog-whistle campaign of Churchill and the Tories, resulting in a 1945 landslide for the Labour Party. So the question of what a government should and shouldn't do is embodied in housing provision in ways that are complex and deep, partly because such questions also unsettle assumptions about labour and labour practices, about which kinds of contribution ought to be recognised and rewarded. The contradiction at the heart of British society which persists today is the absolute necessity of working class labour, that is crucially always fluid and always available, and the absolute contempt in which it is held. And if you'd like evidence of this, see COVID-19. The nation clapped for essential workers during the depth of the lockdown and then turned on these same people, particularly teachers, junior doctors and nurses in the NHS, when they demanded better pay. This could be down to the lack of trustworthy Labour representation in government, both in the Tories and the Labour Party, insofar as the argument for a Labour class that receives through the insofar as the argument that a Labour class should receive through the redistributive mechanisms of the state a fair share of the country's profits no longer flies. Individualism, epitomised by Thatcher's 1980 Housing Act, has made collectivity inherently suspicious, and my feeling is that this suspicion is best shown not in terms of the home as such, but in the notion of housing itself. That is, the ideological framework governing one's movement through public, particularly urban space. The external face, which is the face you often see if you have housing problems. There's a really great book called Fictions of the City, in which Matthew Taunton compares Paris and London as cities that have taken opposite approaches to the question of land and social housing. In London, poorer people were relegated to the inner city, which had been bombed out by the Second World War. In Paris, where less devastation occurred under the Vichy regime, it was the outer suburbs, the banlieue, where modern social housing projects were placed. Taunton takes a different stance to the famous flaneurs and psychogeographers who believe that chance encounters, wandering, and the unexpected are the defining characteristics of a city. I agree with the 3 main points of his argument, that the home should be placed at the centre of a new understanding of metropolitan life, that class in an urban context is more tied to place than theories of the city have allowed, and that easy generalities of the city are impossible if you look at the overlapping truths of how they are inhabited, regulated, and controlled. So Haussmann's building of Paris emphasised the immeuble, and I'm terrible at pronouncing that word, but immeuble, and attempted to thwart the possibility of there ever being a revolution in Paris again. His plan for the city neglected its outskirts, creating a kind of limbo that was neither city nor country, as shown in Van Gogh's Banlieue de Paris in 1886. In trying to understand what is intriguing about this image, I realised it was the pathways that were causing me the most discomfort. It's not obvious what this image depicts, and I think that's kind of like part of the point. This kind of area exists outside of the urban architectural planning within the Paris city walls, yet there are still these like really clearly delineated sort of places where people are kind of supposed to walk, and still a few token gestures to town planning. The grassy plots may seem empty, but they will soon come to be filled by neglected and isolated modernist blocks. So even in 1886, there is a strange sense of these being holding spaces, not Haussmann's focus, and yet somehow under his ideological jurisdiction. Forgotten, as we discover time and time again, all too often entails being under quite a lot of scrutiny, a point I will come back to later. Meanwhile, Thatcher emphasised home ownership and massaged the law such that individuals were entitled to the purchase of their homes at massive discounts, much, much less than the market rate. This masterstroke, more than the crushing of unions, played on those who might otherwise have identified as working class and appreciated the state provision of a home. But the carrot of home ownership, and therefore an upward mobility and identification with the aristocracy, proved irresistible. Why rent when you can own? And we know what happened next. The mass sell-off of council provision ensued, with the result that we are back to square one. Housing poverty among the poorest, vilification of migrants, the overuse of temporary accommodation, which the UK government spends millions on each year paying private landlords, and the alienation of ordinary people who, had they been born a decade or 2 earlier, would have been able to rent at the council rate. More than that, the complete reversal of housing preferences in London has been astonishing. The bombed-out inner city is now the preserve of the wealthy, while the outer rings of London, characterised by urban sprawl, is where much poorer people have been displaced. Although I think Thatcher's Housing Act was a masterstroke of neoliberalism, I think it's also important that she destroyed the National Union of Miners, shut down much of Britain's industry, and created a wave of economic migration and regional decline that led to the bottoming out of many northern cities and the ballooning of London as the economic centre. The preference for the suburb with its own little garden has changed and resembles something closer to the Parisian inner city attitude, and this is partly because a new urban class emerged. They did not have the same scornful attitudes towards concrete blocks and the opportunity to buy a home wherever they could. And when I look at the remoteness of the city in Van Gogh's painting, the indistinct nature of the middle ground and the lonely lamppost in the foreground, I think this is symbolically, if not visually, the case in contemporary London. Something was not foreseen, and something feels lost. So there are several broad areas that I kind of want to visit and that I've been thinking about how I can approach, which is the continuation of Thatcherism, the experience of displacement I've personally felt, and how this is manifesting in London at this kind of pre-war moment, as it's been like very forebodingly dubbed quite recently. And third, I really wanted to share some examples of films that both address the history of housing and the house as a key part of historical history of the historical story, and formally innovate in order to challenge the official narrative. One hopefully leads to the other. But before I do that, maybe we can meet some characters. I want to return to the migrants I mentioned at the beginning, because there's the older matriarch whose forthright attitude is humbled by the racism she receives. Maybe there's the younger, dapper man who lived by his wits and finds himself popular among women and less popular among men. Maybe there's the child who is very bright, but whose accent means she is downgraded at school. All along the streets are substandard houses that are being rented at extortionate rates. In the window of one, a conversation is taking place between one young woman who thinks she might stay in England and another who cannot wait to return to Jamaica. The latter cannot understand why anyone would want to stay in a country that isn't theirs, but we're British, says the former. And this question of belonging lingers in both aromatic and festering clouds, first in neighbouring houses where the partner man comes to collect everyone's weekly share and distributes it in a way that helps people get mortgages and cars. Second, down the road a decade later, when a firebomb destroys a birthday party and kills 13 young black people. I think many of the characters I'm imagining attended the demonstration in March 1981, which signals the beginning of black people staking a definite claim in Britain, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the tragedy began in an ordinary house on New Cross Road, or that it was a party of the kind depicted in Lovers Rock, or that Louisa Marks's tune, Caught You in a Lie, might just have played during the course of that fateful evening. The contemporary response was massive and galvanising, as you can see. Menelik Shabaz's Blood Aga Run, 1981, depicts the events of the fire and the political mobilisation that occurred afterwards, along with many other artistic responses such as Linton Kwesi Johnson's New Cross Massacre. 40 years later, when I was writing Surge, I tried to more definitely tie the narrative of the New Cross fire with later oppressive policing tactics, such as the hated sus laws and, of course, the criminal neglect around Grenfell. It was a small attempt to do something akin to what Alice Oswald describes in her lectures on the concept of the stitch. She describes simile as in some way superior to metaphor, insofar as it stitches language and reality together. Through poems, through the juxtaposition of text messages, book quotes and song lyrics, I was attempting to stitch the narrative differently, to not only revisit it in a contemporary moment, but to ensure that the relationship between the fire, the sus laws and the Brixton riots that followed was not lost over time. I also tried to tie the internal tragedy of that party with deeper questions about gender and race and sexuality that would ultimately find their origins in migration and the economics of migration. In other words, I wanted to emphasise race and gender as economic transpirations shaped by conditions and not purely as inherent or essential identities merely impacted by discrimination. To do what Rhys Auguste's Twilight City was able to do in 1989, that is, to examine queerness not as the afterthought of neoliberal inclusion, nor as a charity case, but as a legitimate and illuminating position within the grander narrative of post-war migration and within the city itself. Moreover, it's a film that begins with a return, this Twilight City that is. The narrator is writing to her mother to explain how London has changed over the last 10 years, yet the mother wishes to come back to the heart of the old empire after going back to Dominica. It's not that this was particularly unusual, my grandmother did the same, but it's interesting that the narrator frames it as a potentially unbridgeable interval, and that these words are placed over images of the homeless, and that a kind of placelessness sets the tone so early in the film. By the end of the clip, the challenge to the mother is whose side she would take in a demonstration for gay rights, the side of her daughter, the narrator, who is trying to get Section 28 repealed, or the side of the hecklers, church ladies, who condemn homosexuality as a sin. Twilight City laments the forces that undulate beneath our feet, fragmenting families, destroying communities, and erasing many vestiges of working class history. We move through the city, lilting, slightly unsteady, affected by laws, bylaws, policies, regulations that are invisible, and yet everywhere seen and felt, like iron filings collecting around a magnet, and yet not collected enough. As one woman in the clip from Blood of Run, which I'm about to show, says, we could really do something if only there was more organised collective unity. But how to fight the myriad laws and their miasmic effects designed to keep people apart? So I'm actually going to do it in reverse order. I'm going to start with Twilight City. And these are sort of, one is quite a chunky section because I think it's really interesting how it blends questions around the rebuilding of London with questions around sexuality and identity and the kind of legal battles that people were kind of fighting then, and then it will be followed by Blood of Run.
Either this will be a success in the terms of the developers and the development corporation, which means that they will have built perhaps 25 million square feet of offices here, and they'll all be occupied, and there'll be a whole series of upmarket shopping centres and private health clinics and so on. Or the area could be a vast, empty set of buildings if the economy collapses or the Japanese economy fails or the oil price drops. Either way, the Isle of Dogs as a working community is going to lose out.
This is a program about murder, architectural murder. You are going to witness the severed limbs, the pulp torso of a great city. No doubt to many of you the word murder will seem exaggerated. You will say that what we call today development is a necessary part of change. If you really think this, so much the worse for you, and so much the worse for your children. They ask for bread, in this particular you give them not stone, but dead concrete, a building like this. Lifeless, faceless, hopeless, joyless, mean-spirited, damning the sky with its load of untrying, ruining everything around it, dwarfing the Festival Hall, the Hayward Gallery, the National Theatre when it's built, defeating in advance any hope of giving London a complex of modern beauty on the south bank of the Thames. The people who designed this thing are, if you can believe it, the heirs of Wren and Nash. To me, they are criminals. Worse are the people who commissioned it, who approved, probably insisted upon its mediocrity. And worse still are the people who indifferently let it happen, who don't even really notice it. If we had any pride in our city left.
There's been an attempt to deflect criticism from what the government is doing, from social injustice, onto individuals who are misbehaving in some way. Part of the Thatcherite right has been trying to impose their own version of Christianity on the rest of the country. So religious organisations have been presenting something of a problem to Thatcher because they have some idea of collective responsibility, of some kind of check on the things that have been going on. A critical response to insider dealing, to the open greed of the marketplace, and however paternalistic, some idea that rich people shouldn't be allowed to do exactly what they like with poor people.
As you know, London has always been a city of uncertainties. I thought I'd learned to live with them, But today something happened which made me think again. My friends and I were on a march against a proposed law now spreading fear throughout London, when I saw a group of your old church friends watching us from the sidelines. One of them held a large placard which said, "Fewer things lower the moral fibre and injure the physique of the nation more than tolerated homosexualism."
Already there's an atmosphere of fear around. Councillors are afraid of being surcharged, so they'll take the easy option very often and cut out any lesbian and gay rights measures, just in case they contravene this law. Very often head teachers or principals of schools or local education authorities will cut out anything that seems to smack of lesbian and gay rights or equality, or informing young people about the nature of the world as it really is.
It's called Clause 28, Section 28 if it becomes law. What would you do if you were here? I imagine seeing you watching my friends and I from the pavement. I wave to you and call your name. I wonder what my friends will make of you. I walk over to the pavement and ask you, why should whole communities be criminalized because of whom they love? Your friends look at me, and then they look at you. What would you say to them if you were here? Would you join me, or would you stay with your friends?
Section 28 has had a very profound effect on the lesbian and gay community. Not just in terms of where we can go, like, is it safe for me to walk along this street? Because now this proactive legislation has made people feel that they can just attack me on a street corner whenever they wish. But also in terms of the way in which we see ourselves. We've been singled out as a section of the community and we have been legislated against. The absence of protective legislation we've always dealt with, the knowledge that it was perfectly legal for someone to sack us from our job, that it was perfectly legal for people to discriminate against us in jobs and services. But now, people's prejudice, their hatred of us has also been legitimised. It also has affected us in terms of the way in which we might want to progress, the decisions, the life decisions that we make. It might be about what career I'm going to go into with regard to teaching or anything else that involves care of other people. We know that prejudice will make it almost impossible for us to survive in those professions.
Dead. Out of these meetings, the National Black People's Day of Action was called and organized for Monday, March 2nd. Despite pouring rain, thousands of black people turned up from all parts of Britain for the start of this protest and solidarity march. The march had been planned and organized on a nationwide basis under the leadership of black political organizations who had come together under the banner of the New Cross Massacre Action Committee. During the period leading up to the march, black people of all ages raised over £19,000 for the families of the 13 dead. The money collected included over £50 donated by black prisoners in Wormwood Scrubs. The march itself took place on a working day, when black workers, students, and school children would come out and join other black people for this National Day of Action, marching over 8 hours from New Cross through to the centre of London, bringing the city to a standstill. The effect of this march forced the political head of state, Margaret Thatcher, to blunder into sending a letter of condolence to the parents of the dead. It was not addressed to the parents, but to a local community worker with an MBE. And to add insult to injury, it was 2 months late. The march demonstrated the unity that can exist amongst black people.
It only goes to show that if we put ourselves together, we could do something. And in spite of all the rain and everything, it's great.
there we go. And this is the poem that came out of having seen that film, Blood of a Run. This is called Songbook. Me say I one step forward and a 2 step back. Me say a 3 step forward and a 6 step back. Me say a 4 step forward and a 1 step back. Me say a 1 half forward and a 1 half back. Me say a left side forward and me right side back. Boss up left side, right side, have to change tack. Me say half the revolution upon the attack. Only half a solution to the things that we lack. Me say gal love reggae and gal love move. Boy love reggae and them love up him groove. The two of them are rub up and starting to move. Crowd gone quiet, people stop yum them food. And I'm watching them see this wicked MC. This beautiful gal all dressed up in green. Nails done nice, hair crisp, what you mean? The baddest little gal them ever did see. Me say a 1 step forward and a 2 step back. Me say a 3 step forward and a 6 step back. Me say a 4 step forward and a 1 step back. Me say a 1 half forward and a 1 half back. Me say the heat of the night will come up through the floor. Black smoke arise, though them never did know. The music come up, the music a jam and the young man a chat. Word fly from him lip like vampire bat. And the gal them a dance and the man them a rock. Drink 6 rum and black and the beat them a drop. Darkness descend and the room gone black. Voices a call, say them half get up. Voices a call, say them half get up. Screaming begin and the people a show. Me say screaming begin and the people a show. Them a cover them head and a cover them mouth. Me say a 2 step forward and a 2 step back. Me say a 3 step forward, 6 step back. Me say 4 step forward and 1 step back. Me say 1 half forward and a 1 half back. Down on the street you see body face down. Picnic fly through the air and mash up on the ground. Flames them fly and a furious red. Boy fall from the window and you know say him dead. Gal fall back inside, we no see her no more. The bright green dress up on the 3rd floor. Policeman come and fireman too. Them startled, them scared, them no know what to do. Mother she a cry and she not have no shoes. Man them a look but to help them refuse. Friend them shocked by the scale of the loss. Me say black smoke a bella down there in the cross. Me say black smoke a bella at the house in the cross. Me say black smoke a bella at the house in the cross. Me say blood a go run for the pain of the loss. Me say black smoke a bella at the house in the cross. Me say a left side forward and me right side back. Boss up left side, right side, have to change tack. Me say half the revolution upon the attack. Only half a solution to the things that we lack. Me say a 2 step forward and a 2 step back. Me say a 3 step forward and a 6 step back. Me say a 4 step forward and a 1 step back. Me say a 1 half forward and a 1 half back. This imperative to maintain a certain keystone force, ensuring the stability of the hierarchy as it stands, is part of the punitive nature of so much legislation, especially around housing. And no film was more influential in showing this than Ken Loach's Cathy Come Home. Although it's been criticised for not proposing any solution to the problem of poor housing provision, nonetheless the film's composition and transmission speaks volumes about how narratives around social issues are shaped. It seems to me that Cathy Come Home was as much about the primacy of television as it was Loach's talent. The Wednesday play format, which has a regular audience with little competition, could operate as a kind of mirror to society, but it was also intrinsically intertwined with people's lives, like music, I imagine, and glued there with a kind of gritty paste that is hard to imagine now. But perhaps this is another criticism of the Loach approach. To be so concerned with the broad message of working class oppression so as to miss an opportunity to dig into the rationale governing social and welfare provision, to provide more of a rebuttal to a logic that keeps families apart rather than an endless appeal for mercy. My point isn't to defend or attack the welfare state, but to notice its punitive character and how this can be hard to defend in an otherwise black and white debate about whether or not the state should provide. I think many people who watched Cathy come home went away with the sense that the solution to Cathy's problem was indeed right to buy, an individualist solution over a more punitive collective one. But even as I watch it, something strikes me about the narrative. There are so many things that go unexplained that are crucial to understanding how and why social housing operates in the way it does, why provision is so scarce, and why people like Cathy end up where they do. The effects of residualization, that is, reserving social housing for only the poorest and most needy, is observed in the banning of fathers from the home, not only in Cathy Come Home, but in the Pruitt-Igoe myth as well. This is Pruitt-Igoe's famous image, which examines one of the most notorious and tragic stories of public housing in America. A housing project that was eventually spectacularly demolished. It was actually televised after falling into extreme deprivation and disrepair. In both of these kind of films, in both of these areas, it feels like the key issue of not allowing fathers to live with their wives if the family needed welfare or social provision is mentioned, but never truly examined or unravelled. The answer is that this was a punitive measure. The failure to attain the perfect family was punished by ruthless separation. When Reg, Cathy's husband, asks why men aren't allowed in the facility, he's simply told, "Men tear up the sheets." So this is what it kind of looked like as it was coming down, but this is what it looked like. This is Pruitt-Igoe, what it looked like when it was kind of still standing, and I'm sure many of you will have seen this image, and what's so funny about this image, and what I find quite disturbing about it as well, is how different it is from everything that surrounds it, and how little provision you can see there actually is. So it's almost kind of like, not unlike a prison, actually. So I really wanted to show you like these two sections from the Pruitt-Igoe myth, and Cathy Come Home, and to show how these kinds of forms of kind of legislation around who can access provision and who can't is used to divide up families and divide up people in extremely punitive ways. So this is Pruitt-Igoe and then Cathy Come Home. So yeah, I think these sections are really interesting in how far apart they are in terms of time, but how they mirror each other. One is in the 60s, one is talking about the policies of the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 70s, 80s. And this, while this doesn't exist, like certainly not in the UK in quite the same way, the policy of breaking people up is still kind of implicit in so many of the ways that housing policy still operates. But what I found really interesting as well is the way that Ken Loach ties together the kind of alienated man with the question of race in the story. I think it's telling that we see a black woman in the home, the women's home, defending herself against a frustrated white woman. I think the argument is a really familiar one. The Caribbean woman is accused of eating up all the resources aimed at the native British population. But the irony, of course, is that if she was taking all of the resources, she would presumably be living in said resources and not lumped with 100 other women and their children. I think it's interesting that Loach spliced these things together, the alienation of the father, the othering of the black mother, the possible abandonment of the child, and how mystified Reg is as well by the way that these things are kind of operating. Even though he is the one experiencing it, there's something about the way that he can't quite believe what's going on and can't quite put his finger on it. The implication, of course, is that if these people can't exist in an ideal form, as an ideal family who can stand on their own 2 feet, then it's better that they're broken up and it's better that they don't exist at all. But now I kind of want to move on to a slightly different area, which is, what is my experience of London? What am I really talking about? Why is this topic so kind of close to my heart? Talking to a friend not long ago, I said I thought London from above was prettier than Paris. Sorry about that, everyone. But when you go over Westminster Bridge, it's hard not to be impressed. I don't feel the same awe when I cross the Seine. My friend disagreed and said that the colour of Paris was far more beautiful than London, and that the uniformity of the architecture was better too. And I understood what they meant, even if I disagreed. My London is red and black brick. It is the modernist slabs by the Thames. It is the idiosyncratic architectural style, usually rocking a plaque from the LCC, which resembles both prison and asylum. For me, London is really the Aylesbury estate. It's Ison's house, which I visited last summer. The estate, which has been in the slow process of decline and demolition for close to 20 years, lost its most famous resident a few months ago when Ison finally gave up her flat. She was a Turkish migrant who moved to London in the early 90s. When I visited her, I was struck by how beautiful it was on the inside, even if I have my beef with how the Aylesbury has been designed on the outside. From her window on the 8th floor, you could see the stunning views and the incredible sunset. So this used to be social housing. It's all earmarked for demolition, as far as you can see up to this window here. And this was from the inside of her flat. And this image here is when she opened it up to the public to kind of tell the story of how this demolition process was taking place, how it happened. So her entire flat, so this entire like council flat had been covered in like images, as you can see, like from various protests and then also legislation as well, pinned to the walls, eviction notices and everything. So you could kind of walk through and have this kind of an incredible experience actually of kind of what she had been fighting pretty much since the 90s. From her window on the 8th floor, you could see the stunning views, the incredible sunset, and the utter waste of good resources that was going on. Thousands upon thousands of empty flats, boarded up, with their facilities smashed up by the police in the middle of a housing crisis. The reason for this was that the local residents had voted against transferring their properties to housing associations. As a result, the council decided to demolish, since it could not bear the costs of maintenance and upkeep. Plus, the Aylesbury is on valuable land. You can see the London skyline, like there, kind of hovering over this kind of like extremely valuable land. It's so valuable that it was sold off cheap for 60 million to private developers. To give you some context, 60 million in London will maybe buy you 50 to 100 houses if you can really budget. The Aylesbury estate is in Zone 1, has over 2,000 flats and is structurally sound. The land value is approximately 600 million. But the council cannot access its true value because councils are prevented from borrowing to cover their housing costs. As Shelter, the housing charity, puts it, the problem is that even prudent council borrowing is counted as national debt, and so they are subject to stringent rules that don't make sense for their constituents. And this is the inside of the building. And so you can just see this, if Kathy come home and Pro Igo show you it, how these legal policies affect families, you can see the literal throwing out of people and the literal prevention of people moving in. There's thousands of people on the housing register, yet if you go into the Aylesbury estate, which you still can kind of do now, this is what you see. This is the corridor. So these have all been like boarded up, but they're all perfectly good, structurally sound flats. Just down the road, the demolition of the Haygate estate, another vast Corbusier-style structure, has resulted in the erection of some admittedly very beautiful but alarmingly priced flats. But whenever I walk around that area, and particularly Elephant and Castle, I try to take a picture. This is because the site changes radically every week. London has always been a place of rapid mercantile aggression, but as Peter Ackroyd puts it, but also a kind of lively and personable marketplace. And this is what this area, the Elephant and Castle, was exactly like that. I took this photo in 2020 when it was had basically just been left in to sort of manage decline, and then this is it in 2023. I think maybe I took this picture in maybe December, possibly January this year. And as you can see, it's kind of it's been entirely demolished. And the word multiplex is kind of like, dotted around everywhere. And it's basically being developed, and it's all privately developed, and it's no longer going to serve the same kind of purpose that it had. But underneath these vast faceless developments is the London of Sisters Uncut, who were able to create East and South London squats, places that could, in their own small way, kind of highlight the problems that many people were facing with these kinds of issues. Back in 2018, 2 buildings were occupied. One was an ordinary flat that was reopened and turned into shelter. Sisters Uncut were an organisation designed to tackle domestic violence specifically, and so questions of housing, particularly beds in domestic violence shelters, were key. And what I find really interesting is that, like, where families do need to be split up and broken apart. In the case of like extreme domestic violence situations, there are no provisions. So a lot of women were kind of forced to stay in situ with violent partners, or forced into temporary accommodation or unsuitable housing that would like damage the remaining relationships further. I remember these spaces not only as sites of political activism, but the thing that we all crave: unstructured, unregulated, unsurveyed social space. There were sleepovers, there were parties and dinners, there were political meetings and workshops. And none of this stuff is far off from what so many groups have done, perhaps most famously the Black Panthers in the US, but also the Black Parents movement in the UK. The housing cooperatives movement in London as well gave rise to Sandford and Deptford and Brixton co-ops, and specifically black organisations such as Nubia Way. But even these are still under threat now, usually from the very housing associations designed to manage it, because of course housing associations are not necessarily operating in the interests of their residents. So it seems to be the same story. A collective emerges, they create something, conditions change, that means they lose control of that said resource, and said resource is sold off. Rinse and repeat. How can we learn from and break that cycle once and for all? And just to show you some more, this is the inside of the Sisters Uncut squat. This was the one in South London, which was the one that I spent most time in. And you can see it's just this amazing space, and it's got similar kind of aesthetic qualities to Ison's Flat, I guess, in that there was so much about the history of the group kind of on the walls, and there was like a little creche so that people could bring their children. And it was a very intergenerational space that was eventually kind of thrown out by Voodoo Ray's Pizza, who eventually kicked everybody out, and they now have a pizza place in Peckham Rye. It's really interesting to read what core members of Sisters Uncut have to say about their activism now, and I feel like there's something about the way that they write about it that is comparable to, I think, the way that Reg in Cathy Come Home clip is reckoning with something. You know, he's trying to kind of understand why he doesn't understand. In Abolition Revolution, Avia Day and Shanice McBean write about their ignorance regarding the true mechanics of the state, particularly in reference to Sarah Reid, who died in Holloway Prison. And this is Holloway Prison, by the way. So this is the prison, and this is what it is now, coming soon, a new destination. They write, "Though we saw ourselves as radicals, our political horizons had been severely limited by the context in which most of us were raised. As our consciousness of the world around us grew," in fact I've got this as text so you can read it yourselves, "from our childhood through to adulthood, the memory of powerful, mass-organised resistance was fading. In these early days, we understood the state made choices, always ideological, about how it approached the perpetration of violence against women. What we hadn't yet collectively clocked was that the state itself was a perpetrator." And later on in the book they say, "As our political consciousness deepened, the shocking details of Sarah Reid's life and how she died in prison shook us to the core. The police entered Sarah's life at two key moments, to beat her and to send her to prison, despite the fact that she was a victim of sexual violence and a grieving mother. They did not see a black woman whose mental health had deteriorated after the death of her newborn baby, a woman who needed love, support and care. They saw a danger that needed containing. Far from keeping Sarah safe, police involvement led to her being found dead in her cell with ligatures around her neck." In a grim irony, as I just showed you, this is now a housing development, part of a major shift to move municipal buildings out of the capital in order to raise capital, that is to capitalise on the land. Walk around London now and you'll see countless police stations, fire stations, schools and prisons converted into housing. The fact that it was once a public institution is almost part of its appeal. Meanwhile, in an echo back to Van Gogh's painting, the machinery of the state is being flung further and further afield, as are those affected by it, into zones that are ever more isolated, ever more disconnected from friends and family, ever more socially punitive. As with Cathy and Reg, the penalty for not being an ideal citizen is that you have no right to be one at all, and housing is one arena in which this punishment is meted out. Council housing, which began as a panacea for horrendous slum conditions in the Victorian era, has ended up as a mechanism for for private profit and the perpetuation of private slum housing in the 21st century. And what's so frustrating about this is that it needn't be so. The early history of optimistic political will shows us this. And nowhere is the absence of political will more visible than in the Grenfell Tower, which caught fire in June 2017 due to flammable cladding. Poor fire safety regulations and administrative neglect. I think we all kind of are very familiar with this, but I don't think many of us are very familiar with the myriad tiny laws and areas of policy and control that resulted in something like this. And so even though I think the grand story seems really clear, I'm not sure that's all there is. Well, I know for a fact that isn't all there is to it. I've often walked around this area of West London trying to understand what it means, how we might learn from it, and how we might shape the narrative in productive ways. In the 7 years since, there have been numerous attempts to capture the story, and survivors and residents themselves have urged people to do so. Otherwise, Grenfell gets forgotten. The grand narrative of a council building that was successively privatised, going up in flames due to both neglect and cheapskate regeneration, probably won't be forgotten. But despite the scale, it might not be the thing that changes anything. So, to return to the margins and to music. In 1948, the Windrush arrived and later became a symbol for mass migration to the UK. After the Windrush scandal, in which the Labour government approved the burning of the official boarding cards of those early migrants, many of whom were subsequently deported by the following Conservative government, there was a renewed effort to celebrate the arrival of that boat and the generation of pioneers, as they are called, who changed the face of Britain forever. Interestingly, several were housed in an air raid shelter under Clapham Common when they arrived. We don't have many records of where they stayed or what their stay was like, but I was asked to create a piece that responded to the story. Given everything I've talked about, I was wary of trying to create something celebratory as such, something that deepened the groove of the official narrative, and so chose to make a sound piece that would emphasise the fact that although this story was useful, particularly for government relations, the government, I think, is having a whale of a time with Windrush at the moment. In fact, Sadiq Khan just released a new map with the Windrush line, which used to be the Overground. They've renamed it all, so there's now the Windrush line. I'm sure that'll do tons for justice for these migrants. I thought it was really interesting that these migrants were like first housed in these tunnels, that these tunnels were almost like the subconscious of the nation in which a new epoch bathed and ate and slept. And so I'd like to end with a segment from the piece, which is entitled Far From the Start. In the same vein as Caught You in a Lie, it is the overlapping, the juxtaposing, the response to a particular space that interested in me, the practice of improvisation, of responsiveness, of formal flexibility played out in a once living space. And this is the tunnel. So I spent like a day recording in here, which was amazing. And I'll just play you a little snippet just of that piece, and I promise it is a little snippet. It's only 2 minutes. Nevertheless, the question arises of how your position shifts in a foreign land when the generation above you dies. The question arises of what it means to be residual, at the end of a story, to be further from the start, for that distance to increase with every death. Did the story start on land or sea, in the longing or the calling, in terrain or in name? Did it begin in the tunnels and radiate upwards and outwards? Was it always, somehow, underground? From heat to a cooler summer, now in a hotter summer. Thank you.